Claire Dawson had never planned to run for her life on a razor-cold, rainy night in Savannah. But when Rick pounded on the door of her old apartment with his fists instead of his voice, she understood that the luxury of waiting for the perfect moment had slipped away, and in its place she did something unthinkable. She ran. No suitcase, no raincoat, only a small purse with a few coins and an old passport. If anyone had asked her whether, at 42, a quiet art teacher could ever imagine crawling into the trunk of a stranger's car to escape a man who once swore he loved her, she would have laughed. Yet the strangest part was not that she hid there, trembling beneath a stray blanket, but that the owner of the car did not scream or call the police when he discovered her. He simply stood there, rain-soaked shirt clinging to his broad shoulders, steel-colored eyes steady on her as if finding a terrified woman curled in his trunk was an ordinary thing on a storm-torn Friday night. His name was Daniel Whitaker, and she had no idea he had once commanded a squad of Marine soldiers, nor that he now owned a vast stretch of land in the northern outskirts of Savannah, the kind of place no one trespassed unless they wished to disappear from the map. But we will speak of him later. First, we must linger with Claire, and the reason she found herself holding her breath in the choking dark of that trunk, praying the man driving that black SUV would not lift the lid too soon. Rain hammered the cobblestone streets in sheets, each drop a needle against her skin. Claire sprinted across a deserted parking lot behind a closed bar, her flats slipping on puddles, long hair plastered to her cheeks. The footsteps behind her grew louder with each beat. Rick, the nightmare that had shadowed her for 8 long months. "You really think you can leave me, Claire?" His voice echoed through thunder, thick with rage. He had once been a police officer, then dismissed for drinking and violence, and he could smell fear in every movement she made. Claire burst into an underground garage, fluorescent lights flickering on damp concrete. No exit, only rows of silent cars. Then she saw it. A black SUV gleaming under a trembling light, engine humming low like the steady breath of a patient predator. The driver's door was cracked open. No one in sight. But what caught her attention most was the trunk, not fully latched. In a moment of wild desperation, she rushed to it, lifting the lid with shaking hands. Inside lay a gray overcoat, a black umbrella, and just enough space for a small woman to curl into. Rick's steps thundered closer, heavy and furious. "Claire, get out here now." She bit down on her lip, crawled inside, pulled the coat over herself, leaving only a sliver of air to breathe. Her heart thrashed against her ribs, each beat a war drum. Through the narrow gap she saw Rick's shadow slide between the cars, his eyes sweeping the garage, his posture that of a wounded animal ready to tear into anything it could sink its teeth into. "You can't hide forever. You belong to me." Her breath stopped short. She pressed a trembling hand over her mouth. In that moment, it felt as though the entire world was collapsing around her. Until a deep voice, low and cold as tempered steel, floated from the far end of the garage. "Is there a problem here?" The voice was not loud, but it carried a quiet authority that cut through the air. Claire widened her eyes, watching through the tiny gap as a tall man stepped from the shadows, shoulders broad, black suit drenched in rain. Rick jerked back, startled. "None of your business. I'm looking for my girlfriend." "Your girlfriend?" the man repeated, his mouth curving slightly. "Strange. From where I'm standing, it looks like a stranger rummaging through my car in my private garage." Rick retreated half a step, and even through her fear, Claire saw him waver. Rick was large, but the Infinda's man before him was something else entirely. Something in the way he stood, hands in pockets, eyes unwavering, spoke of a deadly calm few men possessed. Rick began to back away. I made a mistake. Didn't mean any trouble." "Good," the man said without blinking. "Because if you did, you wouldn't want to know what happens next." Rick turned and stalked away, shouting over his shoulder. "You think you can hide, Claire? I will find you." His steps faded into the night, but Claire still did not dare move. Not until the trunk lifted fully and a warm amber light flooded her eyes. The tall man leaned in, steel-gray eyes widening for a fraction of a second. Claire shrank back, unable to form a single word, but instead of anger, his voice came soft and steady. "He was chasing you?" She nodded, tears streaking down her face. He studied her in silence before offering his hand, large, steady, warm. "Come on, you can't stay in here." Claire took his hand, unaware. that this single moment would alter the course of her life, or that the man helping her was not merely the owner of the car but the one who held an entire corner of Savannah in his grasp, along with secrets she could not yet imagine. And if you are still listening to this story on a Savannah night heavy with rain, standing there with Claire and Daniel, tell us where you are listening from. Perhaps from a quiet town, or a small room where you find a sliver of understanding, a spark of suspense, maybe even a flicker of hope. Leave a comment below so we know how far this story has traveled, and if your heart trembled at the sound of Claire holding her breath in the dark or at the quiet way Daniel reached out his hand, then do not forget to subscribe, like, and share this story with someone who might need a reminder of the silent strength within them. We will return each day with stories full of humanity and tenderness, and you will always be part of that journey. Claire did not know how much of her grip on his hand came from fear and how much from sheer exhaustion, but when Daniel pulled her from the trunk and shielded her head from the rain with his own body, she felt something she could not name, a faint stir of safety even though the man before her remained a complete mystery. He draped his coat over her shoulders, still silent, studying her with eyes that held both suspicion and something deeper he kept carefully hidden. She stood beneath the warm garage light, soaked, trembling from cold, from terror, from depletion. Her hair clung to her skin, her eyes hollowed by sleeplessness and panic. Daniel looked at her for a few moments more, then swept his gaze across the dim garage. No sign of Rick. The night had settled into a deceptive hush, broken only by the whisper of rain and the soft hum of the SUV waiting patiently behind them. "Who is he?" Daniel asked, his voice low but weighted. Claire hesitated. "He used to be my boyfriend. I tried to leave him, but he won't let me go." Daniel said nothing, only gave a small nod before opening the passenger door. "Get in. You can't stand here." Claire wavered. Any reasonable woman would hesitate before stepping into the car of a stranger on a night like this, even one who had just saved her. But she knew what waited outside these walls, and whatever small chance of safety existed lay inside that vehicle beside this man. She climbed in. The scent of leather mingled with pine, and the lingering dampness of rain on his clothes, wrapping around her like something unexpectedly warm. Daniel closed her door, circled the hood, and got into the driver's seat. He took out his phone, tapped a few keys. "I'm telling my men to lock down this garage. He won't come back tonight." Claire looked at him, her voice barely above a whisper. "Who are you?" Daniel glanced at her. "I own this building, and a few others around here." He said nothing more. The SUV rolled out of the garage, and through the blurred window she watched the city fade into streaks of gold and gray. Silence settled between them, broken only by the rhythm of the wipers and Daniel's deep, even breaths. "Do you have anyone in Savannah?" he asked after some time. "No," Claire murmured. "I moved here a year ago to teach. He followed me from my old city. I tried to cut all ties." Daniel nodded, not prying further. She sensed he was not a man who asked unnecessary questions, nor one who rushed to judgment. Yet she also sensed something else beneath the quiet in his eyes, a careful weighing of her presence, an assessment of whether this stranger in his car was harmless, trustworthy, dangerous, or something he could not yet define. She would have done the same in his place. But instead of driving her to a police station or dropping her on the street, he kept on, turning down a tree-lined road heavy with mist. After about 15 minutes, the SUV followed a gravel path leading to a large house hidden behind a curtain of weeping willows. Claire held her breath. The house looked as though it had stepped out of an old novel, stone facade glistening under the rain, steep roof, tall windows glowing with warm light, broad steps rising toward a white-pillared porch. Entirely unlike the rest of Savannah. The car stopped. Daniel stepped out, came around to her side, opened her door, and for the first time spoke with something that felt almost like a promise. "You can stay tonight, only tonight, until I know you're safe." Claire looked up at him, raindrops gathering on her lashes. She nodded. She did not know why he helped her, nor how long she could trust him. But she understood that there are moments in life that defy explanation, like the reason she hid in that particular car, or why he had asked so few questions. All she knew was that she stood before an open door, both literal and something far beyond that, and though the future lay fogged and uncertain, at least, tonight, she no longer had to run. Claire stepped into the foyer of the house with her feet still damp and her fingers clutching the edge of the coat, as if she were holding on to a thin thread of sanity. The scent of old wood mingled with the gentle fragrance of herbal tea drifting through the warm air, making her feel as though she had just crossed out of the cold world outside into a space that did not quite belong to time. Soft golden light from classic crystal chandeliers washed over the gray stone walls, glinting off old frames and neatly hung black and white photographs. The polished brown wooden floor was so spotless that Claire almost felt guilty for the wet footprints she was leaving behind. Daniel said nothing, only gave a slight nod for her to follow. He led her down a long hallway where the sound of the rain outside faded into a distant murmur. Claire tried not to look around too much, yet her eyes still brushed over every detail as if she were desperate to cling to anything that felt peaceful. A marble bust on a pedestal in the center of the hall, a pendulum clock ticking with steady patience, a bookcase lined with old leather-bound volumes. Each object seemed to carry its own memory, as if this house had lived a very long life before she ever set foot inside. Daniel stopped in front of a white wooden door and opened it to a small sitting room. Inside there was a long sofa covered in beige woven fabric, a fireplace burning with red coals, and a solid oak coffee table in the center of the room. He gestured toward the sofa. "You can sit here. I will ask Maria to bring towels and something dry for you to wear." Claire nodded and sat down, feeling the gentle give of the cushions under the warm fabric. The fire in the hearth began to draw the cold out of her skin, loosening the stiffness from her body. A moment later, a woman of about 50 with her hair neatly pinned back and a brisk, capable manner came in, carrying 2 thick towels and a set of cream-colored cotton sleepwear. She placed everything on the sofa and gave Claire a quick look that held both appraisal and quiet kindness. "You can change into these. I left some ginger tea on the table. The bathroom is across the hall. There is hot water. If you need anything, just ask." Claire murmured her thanks. When Maria left, the door closed with a soft click, as though even that sound did not wish to disturb the room. Claire stepped into the bathroom and immediately the warm mist from the shower wrapped around her like an invisible blanket. Water flowed from her shoulders down her back, washing away patches of mud, road dust, and a portion of the fear that still clung to her. When she returned to the sitting room in the loose but clean sleepwear, her hair still damp, Daniel was seated in the chair opposite, a cup of tea in his hand, his gaze resting thoughtfully on the fire. Claire sat back down on her side of the room and lifted the cup of tea, the heat slowly spreading through her palms. She looked at him. In the light from the flames, Daniel's face carried the marks of a life that had seen much. A straight nose, sharply defined jaw, and threads of silver at his temples that made his composure seem even more grounded. The steel gray of his eyes was no longer as sharp as it had been in the garage. Now it was more like a quiet watchfulness. Claire hesitated, then spoke. "You are not going to ask me more questions?" Daniel took a sip of tea, set the cup down, and answered slowly. "Not tonight. You need rest. In the morning, if you are ready, I will listen." Claire was surprised by that calm response. It was not pity and not curiosity. It was a kind of silent respect, something she had not felt from any man in a very long time. They sat in quiet for a while, accompanied only by the soft crackle of the fire and the steady ticking of the pendulum clock. Claire pulled her feet up onto the sofa, wrapped her arms around a pillow, and rested her, cheek on her knees as if bracing herself from within. Daniel rose and laid a light blanket over her shoulders. "The guest room upstairs is ready. If you feel comfortable, I will show you." Claire nodded. She stood and slowly followed him up the old wooden staircase, the steps creaking softly under their weight. At the top, he opened a door and let her enter first. The room was simple yet tidy and warm, with a bed made up in white linens, a bedside lamp casting a gentle glow, and a window looking out over the back garden. Claire turned to thank him, but Daniel had already taken a step back, his eyes steady but never intrusive. "Get some sleep. No one will find you here." Then he quietly closed the door. Claire sat on the edge of the bed and looked around this unfamiliar space that somehow felt strangely comforting. She pressed her hand to her chest and felt her heart still pounding after the long night. Yet here in this austere old house, with its quiet dignity, and a man who spoke little but stood firm like a thick oak door, she felt, for the first time in a long while, something that might be peace. Not complete safety, not yet, but the beginning of it. Claire woke in the middle of the night to a small sound, very faint, as if the wind had brushed against the wooden door or a branch had lightly scraped the window pane. She sat up, heart racing out of sheer reflex, the soft glow of the bedside lamp still burning gently at her side. She listened, every nerve straining in the stillness. There was nothing but the patter of rain on the eaves and the wind moving through the trees in the garden. Even so, her mind could not settle. Her body was clean now, her clothes dry, her arms wrapped around a soft pillow beneath a warm blanket. Yet a part of her still feared that at any moment Rick could kick open the door and stride in. She lay back down but kept her eyes open, staring at the dark wooden ceiling. After a while, still uneasy, she slipped quietly from the bed, eased the door open, and stepped into the hallway. The house was hushed, the long corridor laid with carpet and lined with pools of warm yellow light. As she neared the stairs, she heard a faint rustle, like paper shifting or cloth moving. She tilted her head and looked down toward the first floor. Daniel was in the living room where the fire still glowed, his shirt sleeves rolled to his elbows, the flames playing across the hard lines of his face. On the table before him lay a thick stack of documents, several sheets spread open, and a cup of coffee untouched. He did not look up, yet somehow seemed to know she was there. "You cannot sleep?" His voice reached her easily in the quiet, without a hint of surprise. Claire flushed, suddenly self-conscious as she froze at the top of the stairs. "I am sorry. I did not mean to spy." Daniel shook his head, his tone low and even. "It is all right. Do you want to come down?" She hesitated for a few seconds, then nodded and descended, her bare feet silent on the carpet. As she drew near, she saw that the papers he had been studying were maps of land, transfer contracts, and printed documents marked with red notes along the margins. Daniel noticed her gaze sweep over them and gently closed the file. "My business. It has nothing to do with you." Claire sat in the chair opposite and hugged a small cushion to her chest. The fireplace still gave off a comfortable warmth. She glanced at him. "Are you going to stay up all night?" Daniel leaned back in his chair and rested one arm along the side. "I am used to it. I used to stay awake for a week while on duty. One night is nothing." Claire realized he had never truly spoken about his past. She did not know if he had been a soldier, a lawman, or something else entirely. But it was clear he had lived through days when danger was simply the air he breathed. She lowered her gaze and felt something slowly warming inside her. It was not the house and not the fire. It was the man sitting there, quietly choosing not to sleep, saying nothing, yet clearly keeping watch so that she could rest without fear. "Thank you for letting me stay," she said softly. Daniel looked at her and the gray of his eyes gentled. "I do not abandon someone who needs help. But in the morning we will need to talk. If you can tell me everything, I will know how to help." Claire nodded. There was something in his composure that made her want to trust him, even though instincts shaped by betrayal told her to be wary. She gripped the cushion tighter and gave a tired, crooked little smile. "You are not exactly easy to approach, you know that?" Daniel lifted one eyebrow as if weighing whether that was criticism or praise, then answered simply, "I do not need many people close to me." The silence that followed did not feel awkward. It was just two strangers sharing the same room on a rainy night, each carrying their own private wounds. And in that quiet space, something fragile and undefined began to take root. Claire rose, murmured a good night, and climbed the stairs again. She did not need to look back to know that Daniel would remain there until morning, keeping the house safe, and in some unspoken way, keeping her whole. The first light of morning streamed through the large window, stretching warm, golden bands across the old wooden floor, and Claire woke slowly, feeling as if she had finally slept a full night after months of drifting in and out of fear. Birds chirped somewhere in the garden beyond the house, and the soft scent of fresh coffee drifted through the hall, urging her to rise. She pulled the blanket neatly aside and padded barefoot downstairs, following the familiar hallway until she stepped quietly into the wide kitchen, where Daniel stood with his back to her, pouring coffee into 2 white mugs. Sunlight pouring through the window glowed against his hair, catching the silver strands that blended into the deep brown. He turned when he heard her footsteps, not surprised, not overly warm, simply placing a cup on the table with a quiet ease. Claire nodded her thanks and settled into the chair across from him, resting her cold hands around the warm porcelain. Daniel added a splash of milk into his own mug before speaking. "Did you sleep?" She nodded. For the first time in a long while, they took their first sip, and for a moment silence stretched between them. Claire knew she could not avoid the truth forever. She looked down at her coffee, her voice small, as though saying it aloud might give the nightmare shape again. "You want to know who I am, and why I ended up in the trunk of your car last night?" Daniel said nothing, only watched her with patient eyes that neither pushed nor judged. Claire drew a long breath and began, her voice steady but raspy. "My name is Claire Dawson. I teach art at a public high school in the city. I came to Savannah about 1.5 years ago, hoping to start over." She paused, her fingers tightening around the mug. "I met Rick Connors in my old city. Back then he was a police officer. Charming, polite, the kind of man who knew how to make me feel seen. I had just divorced. I was lost." He walked in as though he understood everything. Daniel's gaze stayed on her, quiet and unblinking. Claire continued, her voice thinning at the edges. "It was good at first. Then a few months later the control started, asking where I went, who I was with, why I was a few minutes late. Every time I pushed back, he'd soften, apologize, cry, and then do it again." She swallowed, vision blurring. "He hit me for the first time on my birthday, because I didn't answer my phone while teaching. He said I was hiding something. I didn't tell anyone. Partly from fear, partly from shame." Daniel set his cup down and leaned forward. "You are not the one who should feel ashamed." Claire let out a brittle laugh as tears slid down her face. "It took me almost a year to leave him. I moved to Savannah quietly, changed my number, told no one where I went, but he found me. He always finds me." She lifted her head, her eyes red yet determined. "I reported him. I filed for a restraining order. But he's former police. He knows how to bend rules, who to silence with a handshake. He's not afraid of the law, only of losing control." Daniel exhaled slowly, his hands clasping together on the table. "Last night, you ran." Claire nodded. "I saw his eyes. I knew that if he caught me again, I wouldn't get away. I didn't know who your car belonged to. I just had nowhere else to hide." The kitchen fell into a deep hush, broken only by the soft drip of the coffee machine and the birdsong beyond the window. Daniel stood, filled the kettle with water, then turned to her with a firm, steady expression. "You can stay here, as long as you need." Claire stared at him, unsure she had heard him correctly. "You don't see me as a burden?" Daniel shook his head, something quieter and deeper shifting behind his eyes. "I once lost someone I couldn't protect. I won't let that happen again, if there's anything I can do." Claire held her breath. His words reached a place inside her that had been frozen for years, and in that moment she realized something real had passed between them, something more than the exchange of painful memories, something fragile yet strong enough to make her feel less alone. The morning unfolded quietly but without heaviness. After telling Daniel everything, Claire felt as though she had finally set down a weight she had carried far too long. They ate a simple breakfast of toast, eggs, and coffee prepared by Maria, then went their separate ways. Daniel had a call with his attorney downstairs, while Claire sat in the reading room with an old novel open on her lap. Though her mind kept drifting back to the years Rick had ruled her life. The wounds no longer different, bled, but they still ached whenever touched. She was deep in thought when hurried footsteps sounded in the hallway, followed by Maria's anxious voice. "Mr. Daniel, the police are at the gate. They need to speak with you immediately." Claire stood at once, her heart hammering. Part of her had expected this, but not so soon. Daniel came up from the lower floor, his expression tightening. He looked at Claire, and with just a single small nod from her, he understood she was ready. She was no longer the woman curled in a dark trunk. They walked together to the foyer, where 2 uniformed officers stood beside a man in plain clothes, with a composed posture and a probing gaze, likely a detective. The man spoke first, his tone formal but measured. "Good morning, Mr. Whitaker. I'm Detective Michael Grant. We received a missing persons report from someone named Rick Connors. He claims his girlfriend, Claire Dawson, was taken from her residence against her will and is currently being held here." Daniel did not flinch. He stepped aside so Claire could stand beside him. She looked directly at the detective, her voice steady. "I am Claire Dawson. I am not missing, and I am not being held against my will." Detective Grant raised an eyebrow. "Can you confirm you are here voluntarily?" Claire nodded. "I came here after fleeing Rick Connors for my safety. I previously filed for a restraining order against him in the city I lived in. There should be documentation." The detective paused, then opened his notebook to jot something down. One of the younger officers behind him looked at Claire with uncertainty, as though her words contradicted the report they had received. Daniel stood firm beside her, his voice deep and unyielding. She is here of her own choosing. This is private property, and I am within my rights to reject baseless accusations, unless you have a warrant or a formal summons. Detective Grant nodded. We're not here to cause trouble. But, Miss Dawson, are you willing to leave this property and come to the station to give a statement? It would help us close the case quickly if you're truly not in danger. Claire looked at Daniel, then at the detective. She shook her head. I won't leave. I'll cooperate, but only in the presence of my lawyer. I've seen how Rick twists the truth to turn victims into the problem. I won't let that happen again. Her calm conviction silenced the three officers for a brief moment. Daniel gave a small approving nod, as if affirming she had chosen correctly. Claire continued, her voice quieter but still firm. I don't want this to become dramatic, but I will not allow Rick to keep using the police as a tool to hunt me and hold power over me. I've endured enough. Detective Grant studied her for a long moment, then released a slow breath. Understood. We'll record your statement and suspend any investigation unless the reporting party offers further evidence. You should be prepared to give a formal statement in the next few days. Claire nodded. I will. When the officers left and the large door closed, the house settled into stillness again. Daniel turned to her, his gaze steady. You did well. Claire blinked, as if shaking off a fog that had wrapped around her for years. I didn't think I could say all of that without shaking. Daniel gave a faint smile, not joyful but acknowledging. Because you're not the woman hiding in a trunk anymore. You're standing on your own feet. Claire felt her heart beat hard in her chest, not from fear this time, but from something rising inside her, something bright and new, like the early sunlight filtering through the leaves and warming a corner of her spirit that had slept in darkness far too long. Claire stood for a long moment in front of the large window after the police left, the pale late-morning sunlight slanting through the trees and scattering shifting patterns across the wooden floor, and though tension still lingered in her chest, threaded through it was a strange new feeling, as if she had just crossed a threshold from which she could not go back. For the first time in many months she had spoken with her own voice, in front of the police, in front of Daniel, and in front of the fear that had clung to her like an old shadow. Daniel stood behind her, watching quietly. He did not speak, only poured another cup of tea and set it gently on the table beside where she stood. Claire turned to look at him, her eyes still red, but no longer uncertain. I know I cannot stay here forever. Daniel did not contradict her immediately. He lowered himself into a chair, resting his hands on his knees, his gaze drifting toward the garden. I used to think the same thing, that I could not stay anywhere for long, that if I stayed I would be in someone's way or bring trouble with me. Then I realized that sometimes the places we never planned to remain are exactly Septi, where we are meant to stop and catch our breath. Claire studied him for a moment, then sat in the chair across from him, clasping her hands together. You once had your own troubles too, did you not? Daniel was quiet for a few seconds, as if deciding where to begin. At last he nodded, his eyes focused on some distant point beyond the window. I used to have a wife. Her name was Emily. We met when I was still in the service. She was a doctor, the kind of woman whose smile could light up an entire room. When I left the military and came back to Savannah, we bought this house. It looked like the start of a new life, steady and solid. His voice sank lower. Then she got cancer. We found it too late. In 6 months, I watched the woman I loved fade away day by day. Claire did not say anything. The grief in his voice was not something that could be answered with comforting phrases. He went on, slowly, as if leafing through old pages in his mind. I did everything I could. The best doctors, the most expensive treatments, new therapies. None of it saved her. And when she died, I was not there. I was in a meeting with an investor, telling myself it would only take a few hours. She could not wait that long. Daniel lifted his head and, for the first time since he began, met her eyes. For a long time I could not forgive myself. After that I shut down. I kept people at arm's length. I did not want anyone to see me weak. This house became a shelter, but it was also a cage. Claire fell silent. She felt his words touch something inside her. Everyone had their own way of locking themselves away after they had been hurt. She had run. Daniel had stayed in place amid the ruins until his heart turned to stone. She set her hand flat on the table and inched it the slightest bit closer to him, saying nothing. Daniel noticed. and he let the past rest. He looked at her, his gaze gentle and firm. You do not have to leave yet. No one will find you here. And if you feel safe, then stay as long as you need. Not for me, for yourself. Claire bit her lower lip, her fingers brushing the rim of her teacup. I am not sure I know how to accept help without someone asking for something in return. Daniel gave a rare, faint smile, as light as a breeze slipping through a half-open door. Then maybe it is time you learned. In that moment, neither of them spoke further, yet something between them shifted, not in any obvious or hurried way, but with a small, almost imperceptible movement of two hearts that had been frozen for a long time and were now slowly thawing, meeting along the delicate line between loss and hope. And in that room flooded with midday light, Claire realized she had found something unexpected, the first place that felt like home since the day she began to run. Claire discovered the room on a clear afternoon after the rain. She had been wandering along the upstairs hallway when she noticed a door left slightly ajar, sunlight pouring through a large window and catching specks of dust floating in the air. Inside was a wide room with wooden floors covered by an old rug, a high ceiling with an antique light fixture, and, most striking of all, an easel by the window beside a long wooden table cluttered with dried oil paint, brushes, scrap paper, and several empty frames. Claire stepped inside as if crossing into an older version of her own life, a world where she had once been someone else, someone who had not yet learned what it meant to be afraid or to run. She brushed her fingertips over the handle of a brush and felt the fine layer of dust cling to her skin. How long had it been since she had painted, not for work, not to escape her feelings, but for herself, because something inside her needed to breathe again. That afternoon she asked Daniel if she could clean and use the room. He simply nodded, offering no questions. Maria brought up a bucket of warm water and several rags, and Claire rolled up her sleeves and threw open the window so that light could flood in. It took nearly an hour just to wipe away the dust and set the easel in place. Then she sat on the floor for a moment, gazing around at the room, now bright with late afternoon sun. A familiar sensation rose in her like the tide creeping up to her shoulders, making her heart beat faster. She began with a few lines in pencil, then watercolors, then oils. Her fingers, stiff at first, slowly rediscovered their old fluidity. Each stroke pulled another memory to the surface. Not memories of Rick or of the night spent in hiding, but the time before that, days when she believed in beauty and believed she had something worth telling the world through color and line. She painted the view of the back garden, the weeping willows bending over the small pond, petals drifting in the breeze. She did not name the painting, letting the colors guide her instead. All the while Daniel stood in the corridor doorway, far enough back that he would not disturb her. He watched her quietly, not stepping in, simply taking in the sight of Claire bent over her canvas, a lock of hair falling over her brow, her eyes intent, her lips pressed together in concentration. She looked entirely different from the woman he had met on that first night, no longer trembling, no longer driven only by fear, but someone slowly reclaiming herself. When Claire finally leaned back and regarded her unfinished work in the fading light, she smiled without thinking. It was a small smile, unshowy, but it was the first genuine one Daniel had seen on her face. He remained still, feeling his heart stutter, not at the painting, but at the gentle presence of something new stirring in his chest, something without a name yet unmistakably real. When Claire turned and caught his gaze, she did not start or rush to hide what she was doing. She simply looked at him, still wearing that quiet smile, and spoke in a low voice that carried all the weight of her. Gratitude without needing explanations. I had forgotten what this felt like for a long time. Daniel answered with a simple nod, as if he understood exactly what she meant. Then, without another word, he walked away, leaving her with her easel, the light, and the deep hush of the room, a place where for the first time Claire no longer felt like someone lost, but someone finally finding her way back. That evening, while Claire was in the studio adding warmer tones to the scene of the back pond she had been working on, Daniel returned from a meeting downtown. His face was more serious than usual, his eyes carrying a weight like a bank of clouds that refused to break. He went into his study, closed the door, and said nothing for almost an hour. Claire sensed that something had shifted. It was not anger and not a clear fear, but a wary tension, as if a door he kept bolted inside himself was rattling against its own hinges. When she knocked softly and brought him his usual evening tea, Daniel only nodded in thanks and did not quite meet her eyes. On the desk lay a stack of printed documents, satellite maps, and several economic reports. One name had been circled in red again and again, Arliston Corporation. Claire stepped back without asking anything, but she knew Daniel was keeping something from her so that she would not worry. What he did not know was that she had heard of Arliston before, and that it was not merely a real estate firm. A week before she fled from Rick, she had noticed a strange folder in his apartment, something she had never been allowed to touch. Inside were lists of names and a series of secret transactions. The name Arliston appeared over and over beside the addresses of properties scattered around the outskirts of Savannah. Rick had brushed it off as old professional work, but the cold calculation in his eyes when he snapped the folder shut had stayed with her. Now, hearing that name again, Claire felt her chest tighten. That night, Daniel sat on the veranda, a glass of whiskey in his hand that he hardly touched. Claire pulled out a chair and sat beside him, close enough to share the air between them without disturbing his silence. The night was gentle and clear, the moonlight filtering through the branches and painting pale patches on the ground. After a long time, Daniel spoke, his voice lower and rougher than usual. Arliston Corporation wants to buy the southern section of my land. They are swallowing up the entire town little by little. They offered a lot of money, and I refused. Claire watched him, her fingers gripping the arm of her chair. And they are not accustomed to hearing no, are they? Daniel gave a dry, humorless smile. They do not play by ordinary rules. I know that. But they had nothing they could use against me. He paused, then glanced at her. Until they found out you were here. Claire held her breath. Daniel went on, every word deliberate. They have hired people to watch. Yesterday I saw unfamiliar tire tracks by the side gate, and this morning, when I was leaving my lawyer's office, a man I do not know asked me about the brown-haired woman at the estate. He did not say your name, but his description was exact. Do you think there is any chance Rick is involved with them? Claire leaned back, her eyes fixed on the dark garden. I am not sure, but I have seen Rick's files. They connected him to some very shady deals. Maybe he works for them, maybe he has been paid off by them. Or worse, maybe he is a pawn in a much bigger game. Daniel nodded slowly. They think you are a witness, or at least someone who knows too much. They believe I am keeping you here to protect whatever you might testify to. If they hold on to that idea, they will not stop at watching. Claire turned to look at him, and this time her gaze held not only fear but resolve. Then what do we do? Daniel studied her and, for the first time, he did not see a victim in her eyes, but someone ready to stand her ground. He answered briefly, yet with an unshakable certainty. We stay ahead. I will not let them reach you, and I will not let them decide how my life is going to play out. Claire nodded softly. In the dark, with the wind whispering through the leaves and the moon casting long shadows across the yard, the two people who had once been fractured and guarded now sat closer than they ever had before, and in that moment they shared more than danger. They shared trust, the quiet and powerful belief that no matter how their past had wounded them, in this present moment, in this old house tucked away on forgotten land, they had found a place they belonged, and someone willing to stand with them to the end. That night the Savannah sky turned a dense shade of deep blue. No moon, no stars, only the soft hush of wind moving through the weeping willows in the garden like a warning carried on a whisper. The house was so still Claire could hear the ticking of the wall clock in the living room. Maria had gone to bed earlier than usual, while Daniel remained downstairs in his study, the only light left burning. Claire sat alone in the studio, the glow from a small desk lamp warming her face as she worked. Before her was a nearly finished painting, its gentle hues reflecting the steadiness she had begun to rediscover. But in the midst of that quiet came a faint metallic tap against the left window pane. Claire lifted her head, brows knitting together. At first she mistook it for a branch brushing the glass, but then it came again, sharper this time, the unmistakable sound of a window latch being disturbed. Before she could react, the window flew open. A man dressed head to toe in black slipped inside like a shadow, a dark pistol pointed directly at her. Claire had barely stepped back when he seized her, clamping a cloth over her mouth and pinning her arms with an iron grip. Her heart seemed to stop. The man whispered into her ear, with a gravelly voice that carried no attempt to disguise the threat. No screaming, or you will not live long enough to regret it. He dragged her out of the studio and down the dim hallway, the gun pressed into her side. Claire fought to keep her wits, mind racing for a way out, but bound and gagged she could do nothing except pray Daniel somehow knew. They reached the lower floor, and the moment they stepped into the living room, the lights snapped on. Daniel stood there, a pistol in hand, his gaze like sharpened steel. He needed no explanation. One glance at Claire trapped in the stranger's hold told him everything. "Let her go," Daniel said, his voice low yet powerful enough to freeze the air. The intruder gave a cold laugh, pulling Claire tighter against him, the gun rising toward her head. "Daniel Whitaker. I have heard the name. I am here with a message for Arliston. Do not think money can shield you forever. Drop the gun and let me walk out. She stays alive, and you stay out of trouble. Otherwise I shoot." Daniel never looked away from Claire. In the harsh light he saw the terror in her eyes, but beneath it he also saw resolve, her effort to stay calm. She did not scream, did not cry, only met his gaze as if clinging to the final thread of hope. He narrowed his eyes, his voice remained steady. "You know who I am, do you not? Then you also know what I used to do." The man stiffened. Daniel took a slow step forward, his gun still lowered but ready. "I served in National Security Special Operations for 10 years. I have watched mercenaries crumble when they picked the wrong fight, and you are no exception." The stranger faltered, the hand gripping the gun loosening for a fraction of a second, and Daniel struck. He pivoted sharply to the right, and in the same heartbeat his gun cracked through the room with a piercing shot. The bullet tore through the intruder's shoulder, sending him staggering. Claire fell toward Daniel as the man lost his balance. Daniel was on him instantly, disarming and pinning him with movements so swift they seemed instinctive. Blood pooled on the wooden floor, but the intruder was still alive. Daniel bound him with an old telephone cord before turning to Claire, pulling the cloth from her mouth and cutting her restraints. She collapsed into him, her body shaking violently as if she had just been pulled from drowning. Daniel held her tight, one hand cupping the back of her head, shielding her from everything that had just crashed into her world. "It is over," he whispered, his voice rough. "I am here." Claire could not speak, tears streaming down her cheeks, not from weakness but from the shattering release of all she had carried for far too long. In the house that had once been a refuge, in a night that had pretended to be quiet but held danger at every corner, she understood that the man holding her was not only her protector, not only a temporary shelter, but the place her heart had begun to belong. 2 hours after the break-in, the police arrived, took statements, and escorted the wounded intruder away, while Claire sat curled on the sofa wrapped in a thin blanket, her eyes never leaving Daniel. Daniel remained beside her, one hand resting lightly against her back as a silent reassurance. But they both knew what could no longer be denied. This house was no longer safe. The man who had come was no lone actor. He was a warning, a test, and when the people behind him learned Claire had survived and was still with Daniel, they would not stop. Daniel stood and made a brief call, then turned to her, his face set with quiet certainty. "We have to leave, tonight." Claire did not protest, only nodded. "Do you have somewhere we can go?" Daniel held her gaze for a moment and then nodded. "Yes, somewhere they will not find." 2 hours later, beneath a sky thick with darkness, a gray SUV rolled away from the Whitaker estate with its headlights off for the first several miles. Daniel drove, eyes sharp and unwavering, while Claire sat beside him clutching the small backpack that held the few essentials she had gathered. Maria had listened to Daniel's instructions through trembling tears and had sent them off with a blessing whispered from her heart. The drive took nearly 2 hours along winding rural routes only locals knew, then veered down a narrow path layered in fallen leaves and tangled roots. When the vehicle finally stopped, Claire saw nothing but the dark silhouette of trees. Daniel cut the engine, stepped out, retrieved a flashlight and a small duffel bag. "We walk from here. About half a mile. There is an old cabin I used to live in after I left the service." Claire followed him, her flat sinking into the damp forest floor. But she did not complain. Perhaps it was Daniel's presence, or perhaps she had simply grown accustomed to upheaval, except this time she was not running alone. When they reached the cabin, Claire paused. It was a small wooden house, 2 stories, tin roof, tucked beneath a large oak tree. It looked as though it had stepped out of an old novel, quiet, simple, completely hidden. Daniel opened the door. Inside it was tidy, smelling faintly of old wood and time, but nothing unpleasant. He lit the fireplace with dry logs he had stocked on his last visit, then pulled blankets from a nearby wooden chest. Claire stood in the center of the room, taking in everything as if trying to see the version of Daniel who had once lived here. "How long were you here?" she asked softly. Daniel set a kettle on the stove before answering. "Almost a year. After Emily died, I could not handle ordinary life. Everything made me feel like I was splitting apart. Here, I did not have to face anyone. Only the wind, the trees, and the quiet." Claire nodded, her gaze drifting to a few old items. A faded photograph of a woman smiling by a window, several worn military books, a small handheld radio on a shelf. Every object bore the marks of a man who had been broken and was trying to mend himself. "Now I am back," she said quietly, but not to hide. "I am here to protect something I am not ready to lose." Daniel looked at her, his eyes gentler than the fire's glow. "You do not have to say anything. Just know that here, you are safe." Claire smiled, though the traces of exhaustion still shadowed her eyes. Not just because of the place, because of the person in it. The silence that followed held no confusion, and in that simple cabin deep in the woods, between two hearts lined with old fractures, something bound them together in a way that needed no vows, no promises. Just the quiet understanding that neither of them would let the other be lost again. The next morning, the forest light filtered gently through the tall trees, falling across the cabin roof in soft golden streaks. Claire woke earlier than usual, the coolness of dawn making her shiver slightly while also filling her with an unexpected sense of renewal. In the small kitchen, she was preparing coffee when she heard the heavy tread of footsteps at the front door. Daniel stepped inside with streaks of mud on his coat and a long scratch running from his shoulder down his arm. Claire set the cup down at once and hurried toward him. "You're hurt," she said, unable to hide the worry in her voice. Daniel shook his head, trying to make his tone light. "I tripped on a broken branch while checking the animal traps. It's nothing serious." But Claire would not let it go. She pulled him down into the wooden chair beside the counter and quietly took the first aid kit from the cupboard. Her hands trembled slightly as she peeled away the torn fabric of his coat, revealing a long, raw cut still seeping blood. "This is your idea of not serious?" she breathed, leaning closer as she cleaned the wound. Daniel watched her, and the tension in his expression eased at the sight of her determined face. "You take care of me like you studied nursing." Claire gave a small laugh without lifting her head. "I didn't, but when I lived with Rick, I had to tend to my own injuries in secret. After a while, I learned how to keep myself from getting an infection and how to hide the marks. No one ever asked what I needed." Daniel said nothing for a moment, then placed his hand over hers, making her look up. "Someone is asking now." Claire held his gaze, something unspoken rising and then settling in her eyes. She finished placing the bandage carefully, almost as though she were mending something far deeper than skin. "When I paint, I feel like I'm talking to the part of myself that used to be alive," she said softly. "The part Rick suffocated, the part that used to believe I deserved something better." Daniel stayed silent, waiting. "When I first moved to Savannah, I couldn't bring myself to hang any paintings. I was afraid Rick's eyes were still on me even when he wasn't there. I was afraid he'd show up at the door and everything would start again. And then I crawled into your car. Maybe it was the most reckless thing I've ever done, but it led me to the only place where I feel like I can breathe." Daniel tightened his hold on her hand, his eyes never leaving hers. "I used to think I had lost the ability to love again," he said in a voice as deep and steady as the wind moving through the trees. "After Emily, I closed every door. I was afraid that if I let anyone in, life would take them too. Not because they wanted to leave, but because everything I hold on to seems to be taken from me. And then you arrived. Nothing like anyone I've ever known. Strong in ways you don't even see." Claire looked at him, tears gathering but not falling. "I don't know if I'm moving forward or just surviving. But here, in this cabin, when you look at me the way you do, I start to believe there might be something beyond fear. Not forgetting, but passing through it." Daniel bowed his head until his forehead rested gently against hers, their breath mingling in the quietest moment the forest could offer. It wasn't an impulsive embrace, nor a desperate kiss, just two people who had once been shattered touching each other with tenderness and understanding. "I will never force you to open your heart," Daniel whispered. "But if you do, I'll be here to catch whatever you give." Claire closed her eyes and placed her hands over his, holding on as if afraid this moment might dissolve when she opened them. In that deep forest cabin, once a temporary refuge. Something had begun to heal without grand promises, but with listening, with shared silence, with wounds acknowledged rather than hidden. And in the gentle morning light, something within both of them began to shift, not rushing forward, only growing honestly. Evening arrived more quickly in the woods than in the city. Late in the afternoon, the sunlight still glistened across the treetops, but less than an hour later the night had wrapped itself around the small cabin, leaving only the warm glow of the fireplace flickering through the wooden slats. Claire sat on the old rug near the hearth, holding a book she had been reading and rereading the same paragraph for nearly an hour. Daniel sat in the armchair beside her, his long legs stretched out, his eyes fixed on the dancing flames while his ears followed every small movement she made. There was no music, no conversation, just the soft crackle of firewood and their quiet breathing, as if they were living inside a moment untouched by time. Claire closed the book gently, her fingers tracing the worn edge of the cover, her gaze drifting to the bandage on Daniel's shoulder. "Does it still hurt?" she asked, her voice low, almost afraid to disturb the peace. Daniel shook his head, the corner of his mouth lifting. "You wrapped it so well, I can't feel anything at all," she let out, a small laugh not at the words themselves, but at the way he said them. Warm, sincere, without a trace of bravado. The sound was brief, but Daniel noticed. He looked at her a moment longer, then spoke in that calm, deep tone she had grown to trust. "It has been a long time since I heard you laugh like that." Claire looked up, caught off guard by the intensity in his eyes. In the firelight his face appeared both strong and peaceful, like a harbor where any storm could rest. She didn't know what moved her, but her heartbeat slowed and then quickened, guided by a feeling unmistakably real. She reached out and placed her hand gently on his, a touch unannounced yet purposeful. Daniel started slightly, not from surprise but from the warmth that surged through the simple contact, warmer than anything he had felt in many years. Claire did not withdraw. Instead, she tightened her grip, her eyes holding his. "I used to think I couldn't touch anyone anymore," she said. "Like my hands carried broken pieces that might hurt someone else." Daniel still said nothing, only closed his fingers around hers. Claire took a deeper breath and leaned toward him, slowly, as if carried by a breath of wind. The movement was light, but for both of them it felt like a tide rising. When their lips met, it wasn't the fierce kiss of people seeking distraction, but the quiet merging of two wounded souls trying to mend each other with the gentleness still left within them. Her lips were soft, trembling slightly. His were warm, steady. They closed their eyes, letting space and fear and old pain dissolve into the shared breath between them. When they parted, Claire stayed close, her forehead resting against his, their breaths slow and full as though they were holding the moment in their hands. Daniel spoke first, his voice drawn from somewhere deep inside. "If this is a dream, I don't want to wake up." Claire gave a fragile smile, her eyes glistening. "It's not a dream. It's the first time I've chosen to come back to myself." Outside, the forest wind sighed through the leaves as if offering its blessing, and inside, between two people who once believed they had nothing left to lose, something new had been found without expectation, without demands, simply real. 3 days after their first kiss, the peace around the cabin still held like a cocoon, a temporary shell that kept them completely separate from the world beyond the trees. Claire and Daniel lived each moment slowly, sipping morning coffee together on the wooden porch, reading in the gentle forest light, sometimes cooking side by side with the simple ingredients they had brought from the estate, and it felt as though a new chapter was unfolding before them, tender and healing, yet nothing could remain hidden forever under the open sky. The bad news came at midday, when Daniel switched on the small hand radio that linked to a private channel he still used with a few old contacts from the security forces. The signal crackled for a few seconds before a man's voice came through, urgent and heavy. Rick Connors just disappeared from Savannah. No trace, no vehicles recorded leaving the city. There is a good chance Arliston Corporation moved him out through their own route. Worse, I got word from an inside source. They have hired people to track Daniel Whitaker. They know you are no longer at the estate. The cabin might be the next stop. Daniel sat in silence for several seconds, his hand tightening around the radio until his knuckles went white. Claire was in the kitchen, humming softly as she prepared lunch, the lightness of her voice so at odds with the message that his chest constricted. He turned off the radio, rose, and strode into the kitchen. Claire turned, the smile still on her lips, but one look at his face wiped it away. "Something happened, did it not?" she asked, her tone changing in an instant. Daniel stepped closer and set his hand on her shoulder, his voice low and controlled, though his eyes clearly betrayed the impact. "Rick is gone, and Arliston knows I left the estate. They may have already identified this cabin." Claire froze, her body cooling as if doused in cold water. "You think they will come here?" Daniel nodded. "Not immediately, but they will. They do not stop when they feel threatened. And if Rick is hiding under their protection, he will try to reach you before the truth catches up." Claire swallowed, but this time she did not unravel. She took Daniel's hand, her gaze steadier. "Then we do not run. You told me we have to stay ahead, remember?" Daniel studied her, and his expression slowly softened. "That is right, and this time I will not wait for them at the door." All that afternoon he opened an old wooden chest in the storage shed behind the cabin and pulled out maps of the forest, communication devices, small weapons, and a bundle of files on Arliston he had quietly compiled. Years earlier, he had once investigated the corporation's illegal activities while working as a private security consultant for a large land trust in Savannah, and he knew their system had weak points. Meanwhile, Claire moved with him, helping mark the most exposed vantage points around the cabin, checking the motion cameras Daniel had installed months ago to monitor wildlife, now repurposed into a makeshift early warning system. That evening, Daniel spread a map across the center table, shining a flashlight over key locations as he outlined his plan with a voice calm yet utterly resolute. "I am leaving tonight. I will take the northern trail and cut down to the small town about 50 miles from here. I have a reliable contact there. They can get us Arliston's financial records, proof of money laundering and tax evasion, and files on employees who were threatened into silence. If we gather enough, we can force the authorities into a formal investigation." Claire watched him, hope flickering in her eyes. "What about me?" Daniel paused, his gaze holding hers before he answered. "You stay here at the cabin, but not alone. I have already sent the coordinates to Rob, an old teammate. He will arrive within 12 hours, fully equipped, someone I trust with my life." Claire gripped the front of her coat and rose to face him. "I do not want to be separated, but I understand. This time we are not just running, we are fighting." Daniel cupped her face in both hands and pressed his forehead to hers. "I promise I will come back, and when I do, no one will ever threaten you again." In that small cabin deep in the woods, where once only the soft sounds of nature had lived, there was now the quiet urgency of preparation for a counterattack, not for revenge, but to end the long days of being hunted. Claire and Daniel were no longer fighting only for survival, but for the right to love without chains and without fear. The morning after Daniel left, a light mist lay over the forest like smoke caught between branches. Claire woke early, wrapped her wool sweater tightly around herself, and stepped out onto the porch. There was no Daniel beside her, no low murmur of his voice wishing her good morning, no faint scent of coffee already brewing, yet she did not feel the same emptiness that had once haunted her when she lived alone. Now she was no longer truly by herself. Even when he was gone for a while, she knew he would return, and this time she would not simply sit and wait to be rescued. True to Daniel's word, before midday a silver pickup truck rolled to a stop in front of the cabin. The man who stepped out was Rob, tall and solid, his face weathered by sun, his gaze sharp like someone who had walked through more than one battlefield. He greeted Claire in a low, rough but friendly voice and introduced himself as Daniel's old combat partner, a man who had served with him in Afghanistan. "Daniel told me to teach you what you need in Argo, case things go bad. Not because he doubts this place, but because he knows you are strong enough to protect yourself." Claire did not object, only nodded. Before Daniel left, she had sensed this was coming, and for the first time in her life, she was not afraid to touch a gun. It no longer felt like the symbol of cruelty it had been when Rick used it to terrify her, but a tool that could keep her from ever being controlled like that again. Rob laid out training gear in the clearing behind the cabin and chose a compact Glock that fit well in her hand. He showed her how to hold it properly, how to keep her breath steady as she squeezed the trigger, how to check the chamber, change magazines, and study her surroundings. At first she was awkward, but she never complained, never gave up. She pressed her lips together, absorbed each instruction, adjusted her stance after every correction, learning to tame her breathing and keep her mind from being swallowed by old fear. After a few hours, she could hit center mass on the target from 10 meters away. Rob nodded, approval clear in his eyes. You learn fast. Not many people can keep their breathing that steady under pressure. Claire smiled faintly, sweat glistening on her brow while her eyes stayed bright. I spent years controlling my breathing, just to get through days with someone like Rick. Now I am just learning how to turn that into action. In the days that followed, between shooting sessions, she learned to read the signs in the forest, to use the shortwave radio, to respond if someone breached the perimeter. She practiced moving quietly across carpets of leaves without making a sound, learned to distinguish between the steps of a person and the movements of animals, and helped design a defense plan for the cabin itself. With each passing day, Claire felt something shifting inside her. The woman who had once trembled in the trunk of a car was now someone who could load a magazine in the dark without looking. One afternoon after they finished training, Rob handed her a bottle of water and spoke with open sincerity. I have seen people who seemed the weakest become the strongest when they had a reason to fight. You have a reason, Claire. That will keep you alive. And maybe it will keep Daniel alive too. Claire stood quietly for a moment, gazing at the trees darkening to deep gold as evening sank into the woods. I do not want to be a hero. I just do not want to be afraid anymore. Rob nodded and said nothing more. He understood. That night, as Claire sat alone by the fire, wiping down the small pistol and packing the radio into her backpack, she felt something clearer than any bruise she had carried before. This time, if Rick or anyone else crossed that wooden threshold intending to hurt her, they would not meet the woman who used to cower in fear, but a new Claire, steady, clear-eyed, and ready to fight not only for herself, but for the man she loved who was out there, risking everything to protect them both. 3 days later, Savannah drowned under a heavy rainstorm that fell like sheets being shaken loose from the sky. The familiar streets now submerged in murky gray water as the streetlights cast faint halos over puddled pavement. Claire sat behind the wheel of the old car Rob had prepared for her hands gripping the steering wheel, her palms damp with sweat despite the cool air humming through the vents. She had never imagined she would return to that apartment, the place that had once been a prison without bars, where even the sound of a turning doorknob used to chill her to the bone, but today she had not come back for her past. She had come for her present. After Rob received word from an inside source that Rick had slipped back into the apartment to retrieve certain documents, Claire didn't hesitate. She asked to go. Not to play the hero, but because she knew it was time to face the nightmare that had haunted her for so long. No more running, no more trembling. She needed to look him in the eye and know, without doubt, that the man who once made her shrink inside herself had no power over her anymore. The apartment lay on the 3rd floor of an aging building along the Eastern District, where everything still bore the stains of time and mildew clung to the hallways. Claire climbed slowly, each step echoing like a memory against the concrete stairwell. The door to apartment number 3 looked unchanged, the gray paint still peeling, the scratch marks by the lock still visible where Rick had once punched it in a fit of rage. Claire drew a deep breath and knocked. No response. She knocked again, harder. Footsteps dragged behind the door, then the click of the lock turning. When the door cracked open, Rick appeared, his face gaunter than before, yet his eyes still clouded with that old, sick need for control. He froze when he saw her. "Claire?" he muttered. She didn't answer. She simply stood tall and looked at. Confusion flickered across Rick's face before he forced a smirk, that familiar, arrogant curl she had once known too well and learned to hate. "What are you doing here? Miss me already?" Claire didn't look away. "I came to take back something you were never allowed to hurt my fear." Rick raised an eyebrow and gave a hollow laugh. "Do you think standing there spouting tough lines erases everything? Do you know who you're talking to?" Claire stepped forward, her eyes unwavering. "I know exactly who I'm talking to. A man who hit a woman to feel powerful. A failure so empty he needed violence to control someone else. But I'm not the woman you used to know. I'm not afraid of you. Not anymore." Rick moved closer until his face was inches from hers, his breath thick with cigarettes and exhaustion. "You shouldn't provoke me, Claire. I can still—" She stepped back half a pace and reached inside her coat, pulling out the compact Glock, not aiming at him but holding it steady. She did not shake. She did not falter. "If you take one more step, I will protect myself without hesitation." Rick froze. Not because of the gun, but because the woman standing before him was someone he had never met. No trembling, no pleading, only a steady gaze and a calm that disarmed him more effectively than any weapon. Claire lowered her voice, each word sharp and clear. "I didn't come for mercy. I came so you would understand that I'm not afraid anymore. You don't control a single second of my life now." Silence swelled between them. Then Rick let out a bitter laugh. "You think letting go of me fixes this? You really think Daniel can protect you forever?" Claire tilted her head slightly, her lips forming a thin, deliberate smile. "Daniel doesn't have to protect me anymore. I can do that myself." She turned and walked out, never looking back. Each step she took felt like stepping over fragments of her old life, scattered and useless, behind her. When the door shut at her back, she descended the stairs without feeling any weight dragging at her shoulders the way it once had. Outside, the cool wind brushed her cheek like the touch of freedom she had just reclaimed, and for the first time since everything began, Claire wasn't just surviving, she had won. The rain still pounded Savannah when Daniel stepped out of his truck, his boots soaked but his eyes sharp as tempered steel. He stood before the old bar on 11th Street, once a gathering place for Arliston's foot soldiers and, according to Rob's latest intel, the last known place Rick had been seen barely 30 minutes earlier. Daniel didn't waste time. He walked in without a word. The dim lights and the throbbing murmur of old rock music thickened the smoke-heavy air, but among the scattered faces Daniel spotted Rick immediately at the last table by the window. The man wore a dark coat, his hair disheveled, his face more hollow than the last time Daniel had seen him, yet still clinging to that tired, brittle arrogance. When he recognized Daniel, he stiffened, his glass tilting in his hand. "I wondered if you'd show," he muttered. Daniel didn't respond. He pulled a chair out and sat across from him, the space between them becoming a dense weight that drew glances from the men at the next table before they quickly turned away. Daniel stared straight into Rick's eyes, his voice low and even, cutting like a cold blade. "Claire saw you. She walked out of that apartment on her own without ever looking back. That tells me everything I need to know." Rick gave a harsh snort, trying to recapture his swagger. "You think she's strong? A weak woman like her doesn't exist without someone like you to hide behind." Daniel narrowed his eyes and leaned slightly forward. "Wrong. She is stronger than you can imagine. She survived you. She doesn't need me to hide. She only needs me because she chooses to love. And I'm here not to speak for her, but to tell you this: your game is over." Rick barked out a short, cracked laugh. "Game? What, you think your moral lecture scares me? You're not some special forces hero anymore. You're just a washed-up ghost with blood in your past." Daniel tilted his head, and something darker passed through his eyes. "I don't need weapons to scare you, Rick. Just the truth. And the truth is that everything you relied on has collapsed. Arliston is under investigation. The documents you thought were your insurance are already on a federal prosecutor's desk, and you are the weakest link. No one is protecting you now." Rick's expression faltered, his face paling beneath the bar lights. Daniel continued, each word hammered into the thick wooden table between them. "I don't need to lay a hand on you. The law will do that. But if you go near Claire again, I won't call the police. I'll come myself. And then I make no promises about how our conversation will go." A flicker of fear darted through Rick's eyes, though his lips still trembled in defiance. "She's not worth all that, Whitaker." Daniel rose, his gaze steady. "To me, she is everything." Without waiting another heartbeat, he turned and walked out of the bar, each step extinguishing whatever flimsy sense of power Rick had once clung to. Rick sat frozen for several minutes, his face stripped of every trace of arrogance. He glanced around the bar, and for the first time in his life he felt utterly alone, no allies behind him, no shadowy force left to hide behind, no illusion of control to prop up a man who had once believed he could rule his world with fists and lies. When he finally left the bar, he didn't speak to anyone, just lowered his head and hurried across the rain-soaked street, his coat plastered to his back. He didn't know where he was going, only that he had to go far away from the city he once thought he owned. And in that relentless Savannah downpour, Rick ran not because someone was chasing him, but because he no longer had the courage to face the woman he once believed would forever stay trapped in his cage. But that woman had become a survivor, and standing behind her was a man he could never overcome. That late afternoon, when Daniel returned to the cabin in the woods, Claire sat alone before the cold, extinguished fireplace, her arms wrapped around her knees and her forehead resting against them, the last light of day slanting through the wooden window in a pale gold that felt as fragile as she did. She hadn't heard the truck outside, nor the door open, and she didn't know Daniel was there until he quietly placed a hand on her shoulder, the familiar warmth of it making her flinch before she lifted her head. Her eyes were rimmed in red, her lips pressed tight as though she were trying to swallow down something heavy and aching. Daniel said nothing at first. He simply lowered himself beside her, his hand still resting on her shoulder like a silent anchor. After a long moment, Claire finally spoke, her voice hoarse and small like wind slipping through dry branches. "I thought I was stronger than this." Daniel watched her, waiting. She turned away, as if unable to bear the steadiness in his eyes. "Today, when I faced Rick, in that moment I thought I had made it through. My hands didn't shake. I said things I never dared say before. But now that you're gone for a while, now that I'm sitting here alone, everything comes back. The memories, the fear, the screaming, the times I held my breath waiting for his anger to pass." Daniel didn't interrupt. His gaze softened. Claire continued, her words spilling out as if keeping them inside would suffocate her. "I thought standing up to him would erase it, that not being afraid of him anymore would be enough. But what he left behind wasn't bruises on my skin. It was cuts inside me, deep ones, the kind that made me forget who I was." Daniel wrapped his arm around her shoulders and drew her gently against him, letting her rest her head on his chest. "Claire, no one heals everything in one try. No one wipes away years of terror with a single confrontation. You did something most people can't do. You stood up. You looked him in the eyes. That doesn't make you weak. That makes you stronger than you realize." Claire only nodded against him. He tightened his hold, his other hand sliding through her soft, tangled hair as she closed her eyes and let the rhythm of his breathing soothe the raw edges of her thoughts. "I know the world you just stepped out of," Daniel said, his voice dropping to that deep, quiet tone that always reminded her of a stream moving through the woods at night. "I've had nights where I dreamed of Emily screaming because I wasn't there to protect her. I thought I'd never love again because I was convinced that loving meant losing. But then I met you, and I'm not afraid of that anymore. You don't need to be perfect. You don't need to be strong all the time. You only need to be yourself. And I'm here to remind you of that every time you forget." Claire broke then, not with sobs, but with slow, heavy tears that slid down and soaked into his shirt, each drop carrying a weight she had carried too long. She wrapped her arms around him, not because she needed a lifeline, but because she didn't want to lose something that had quietly become more important than her fear. In that moment, surrounded by the remnants of old pain not yet fully healed, Claire understood that her heart no longer belonged to her past. It was beating again, no longer for survival, but for love. And the man who held her, steady and infinitely patient, was where that heart wanted to stay. The next morning, a soft knock at the cabin door woke both of them from the late sleep that had followed an emotional night. Rob stood outside, his coat dusted with morning mist, a thick file tucked under his arm, his face no longer strained but lit with the tired satisfaction of someone who had just seen a battle through to the end. "They're done," Rob said simply, as he set the file on the wooden table. Daniel opened it, flipping through pages of financial statements, contract copies, employee testimonies, photos of covert meetings, and evidence of Arliston bribing, threatening, and silencing officials and witnesses. Everything had been delivered to the state prosecutor the night before. The investigation that had been quietly building for months finally had its killing blow. And then, like a final puzzle piece falling into place, Rick had been arrested only hours after fleeing Savannah. He'd been stopped at a state border checkpoint with forged documents. The footage of him in handcuffs, head bowed, played on the morning news while Claire stood motionless before the tiny cabin television, her emotions caught between relief and a strange emptiness. Daniel stepped behind her and gently took her hand. "He can't hurt you anymore. He has nowhere left to hide." Claire nodded, her eyes still fixed on the image of Rick being escorted away by 2 federal agents, not out of triumph, but because for the first time she truly believed that evil could not always outrun justice, that sometimes the long road and the tears and the dread could still lead to what was right. 3 days later, Daniel drove Claire back to the estate on the outskirts of Savannah, the winding road leading toward the place where everything had begun looking strangely renewed. When the truck stopped before the familiar black iron gate, she held her breath not from fear, but from the soft tremor of returning to a place that was no longer a refuge or a hiding spot, but a choice. The gate opened, revealing the old stone house glowing under the afternoon sun, its moss-covered walls now cleaned, the bougainvillea along the porch erupting in vivid purple blooms. Everything looked alive again. Claire walked slowly along the gravel path, her fingers brushing the brick wall, the familiarity of it rushing back like a dream she could finally touch with steadier feet. Daniel walked beside her, silent, each of his steps close to hers, as if to remind her he always would be. Inside, the house was the same, and yet no longer cold, no longer temporary. Claire stopped before the easel in the living room, where she had first begun painting again after months of fear. The unfinished canvas was still there, missing only a few final strokes. She turned to Daniel, her eyes soft. "I want to finish it. Not to heal the past anymore, but to paint a beginning." Daniel smiled and reached into his pocket, pulling out a small key. "I think you should have this. From now on, this is our home, if you want it to be." Claire looked at the key in her hand, then at the man before her, the man who had kept watch so she could sleep, who had taught her to shoot so she would never fear again, who had protected her, not with force but with patience. She didn't need to speak. She stepped into his arms, holding him and the future she had never dared imagine. That night, the glow from the windows spread across the garden like a quiet promise. Someone had come home, and a new life had begun. No shadows lurking in corners, no nightmares waiting at the door, only two people, once broken, now building something together with courage, with trust, and with a love they had both learned to believe in again. The night air in Savannah softened like a quiet spring whisper brushing against the soul, the breeze drifting in from the river carrying the scent of orange blossoms mixed with the faint aroma of old wood from the historic homes nearby. On the rooftop terrace of the estate, once the stillest and loneliest corner of the house, warm golden lights now glowed, and gentle music floated from the small speaker resting on the table. Claire wore a simple cream dress, her hair falling loosely in the breeze, her fingers intertwined with Daniel's as he invited her to dance with a slight bow of his head and that tender smile she had come to know more deeply with each passing day. They danced beneath the night sky, with no audience, no stage, only the two of them, a slow melody, and eyes that never drifted from each other. Under the full moon shining through the distant treetops, their steps moved softly and unhurriedly, as though every wound they had ever carried had fallen away like dry leaves swept off by the wind, leaving behind fresh ground ready for love to take root. Claire looked up at his face, her eyes shimmering with tears that were no longer born of pain or fear, but of gratitude, of peace, of a quiet faith in something she once believed impossible, a new beginning. Daniel leaned down and whispered against her ear, his voice brushing gently against the steady rhythm of her heartbeat. He told her that if life offered him the chance to choose again, he would walk through all the losses, all the grief, just to arrive at this moment. Claire didn't answer. She simply smiled and tightened her hold on his hand. Some love stories do not need many words, for the presence of the other person is already the answer to everything. Their journey was never the tale of two perfect people finding each other. It was the story of two cracked, wounded souls brave enough to walk through their past and learn how to love again with every ounce of courage they had left. This story is not just a romance. It is a testament to the power of healing, of patience, of kindness. It reminds us that even in the midst of pain that feels unmovable, there is always a door cracked open toward hope. What matters is whether we have the courage to step through it. And if you are watching this video, perhaps you, too, carry a private story, an unhealed scar, or maybe just a quiet doubt about whether love still has a place for you. But dear friend, believe this. Just like Claire and Daniel, you deserve a gentle ending. Thank you for staying with us until the very end of Claire and Daniel's journey. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, like, and share the video so we can spread a little more light to those who may need it. We would truly love to hear from you. Leave a comment below and tell us what moment in this story moved you the most, and whether you found a reflection of your own journey in Claire's path. Your heartfelt responses are our inspiration as we continue bringing meaningful stories to life each day. Farewell for now, and we hope to see you in the next video, where more beautiful, emotional, and deeply human stories will be told with the same sincerity and care. Wishing you good health, a peaceful life, and days filled with chapters worth remembering. Goodbye, and see you again soon.